We've mentioned ARIA a few times already in this training. Now we're going to go more in-depth into what it is. ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. It's a W3C standard that adds attributes to HTML. You've likely encountered some of these attributes in dev tools, or when using a component from a library or framework. These attributes help assistive technology like screen readers better understand and interact with complex user interfaces. For example, ARIA conveys important information about the role of an element, like whether it's a button, a link, or a menu. ARIA communicates the property of an element, such as whether it's selected or not, and it communicates its current state, telling you whether a modal, for example, is open or closed. In short, ARIA ensures that dynamic and interactive content is both usable and understandable for users who rely on assistive technologies. Let's break down some examples of ARIA roles, states, and properties. First, we have a dialog element, which is implemented as a div element with role equals dialog. This tells the screen reader that the element is a dialog, which is a very impactful design pattern for assistive technology users. On that same element, we have ARIA modal equals true. This property indicates this is a modal dialog, meaning it restricts a user's ability to navigate content outside of the dialog until the user takes an action within the dialog. Conversely, a non-modal dialog might visually overlap content on the page, but does not restrict users from accessing content outside of the dialog. Finally, the element has ARIA labeled by equals intro-01. This property links the dialog to a heading with an ID equal to intro-01, providing context for users around what this modal dialog is. Next, we have another example of a button that uses ARIA. It has a state of ARIA expanded equals true, which informs users that a submenu, panel, or similar is currently expanded. It also has ARIA controls equals panel-01. This establishes a programmatic relationship between the button, the control, and the element that it controls, such as a corresponding submenu or accordion panel. By using these ARIA attributes, we can give assistive technologies more context and help navigate dynamic content more effectively. Custom user interface components may not have an HTML equivalent. In general, we always recommend that semantic HTML be used whenever possible. But there are some things that semantic HTML can't do, and that's what ARIA is intended to step in and provide. It's really useful when there isn't an HTML equivalent, or when non-standard HTML, non-semantic HTML, is being used. A couple of important things to take into consideration here. ARIA does not change keyboard interactions, so it doesn't automatically add keyboard interactions if you add role equals button. It also doesn't, whether this is a good or a bad thing, change the visual appearance of an element. It is not going to make a button look like a button just by adding role. ARIA is an essential tool for providing accessibility, but it works best when used in combination with properly structured HTML and thoughtful design. ARIA is a pretty powerful tool, but it must be used carefully as there are a lot of ways that it can be used improperly. When used incorrectly, it can introduce accessibility barriers for users, making it harder for them to navigate or interact with web content. In fact, in a 2023 survey across the top 1 million websites, it was found that homepages with ARIA had an average of 68.6% more accessibility errors compared to homepages that didn't have ARIA. This highlights the importance of using ARIA correctly and thoughtfully. So how do you avoid ARIA pitfalls? The first is using ARIA Authoring Practices Guide, or more commonly known as the APG, as a reference for established patterns. And the second is to follow the W3C's 5 rules of ARIA use. Let's talk about both of these. The APG is the go-to reference when implementing ARIA. In addition to the required ARIA roles, states, and properties, every design pattern within the APG has a set of keyboard interaction sections that describes how a specific complex ARIA widget should be interacted with using a keyboard. This is important because not all users will understand how to interact with some of these complex widgets. And when they're implemented differently, it can create a confusing or difficult to use experience, especially if we're talking about two different experiences within the same application. In general, I would recommend looking at this first when creating complex ARIA widgets. The second approach is to follow the 5 rules of ARIA. These rules are: use native HTML elements before using any ARIA. Don't change native HTML semantics with ARIA. ARIA must be usable with a keyboard. don't use ARIA to hide focusable elements, and all interactive elements must have an accessible name. Let's dig into what those are. The first, use a native HTML element or attribute with the semantics and behavior you need before using ARIA. On this page, we have a div with role equals heading and ARIA level equals 2. This is technically correct. However, it is much easier to just use an H2 element. It creates a lot less confusion, is less brittle, and is generally easier to do. Below that, we have a button that's a span with role equals button and tab index equals 0. This could be easily replaced with a button. So whenever it's possible to use a button instead of this role equals button and tab index equals 0, you'll get a lot of accessibility right out of the box. The second rule of ARIA is don't change native HTML semantics unless you really have to. For example, in the top here, we have a link tag with role equals button. So we're changing a link to a button. A lot easier to just use a button. In that case, there are things that need to be taken into consideration to properly change a link into a button. The second example here is an H2 with role equals tab. H2 has a role, its role equals heading. So it's not a good idea to necessarily change a heading into a tab. A better solution is to have an element with role equals tab around a heading. The third rule of ARIA is that all ARIA controls must be usable with a keyboard. ARIA does not dictate keyboard behavior, so your components need to provide this functionality. I mentioned earlier that adding role equals button to a div or a span doesn't automatically make it keyboard accessible. So in order to do something like that, if you really want to use a non-semantic element and change it to a button, in addition to changing the role, you have to ensure that it's included in the page tab order by using tab index equals 0, and add some event listeners, such as activating on click, enter down, and spacebar up events. Now on the right-hand side of the screen here, we have that span role equals button with a warning label, because that isn't quite enough. The fourth rule of ARIA is don't use ARIA to hide or remove semantics from focusable elements. We'll take a look at some examples here, but doing so will result in some users focusing on nothing, causing screen readers to make no announcement or announcing blank when reaching the focusable element. Essentially, you're telling the screen reader that there's something here, but also telling it, don't pay attention to this. For example, you shouldn't add ARIA hidden to a link like we have with the first example. We also don't want to add role equals presentation to a button, because that changes the role of the button. And finally, the third example we have is ARIA hidden on a nav. We wouldn't want to hide that nav or remove its semantics, because navigations are incredibly important, especially for keyboard users. And the fifth rule of ARIA is that all interactive elements must have an accessible name. In the first example here, we have a link with an href attribute and no text inside of it. If somebody used a screen reader or any other assistive technology to reach this link, they would hear link or button, but they wouldn't hear any name. So they would have no idea what this would do. This example commonly happens when you have icon-only buttons, and the icon is added through CSS or some other means. But screen readers and other assistive technologies don't have access to that visual information, so they don't understand what that button is supposed to do. Ways around this are to use one of the other examples that we have over here on the screen. The second example, we have just text inside of that link. That is the easiest way to add an accessible name to a link. The next example, we have ARIA labeled by, adding an accessible name to a link, but it's also pulling in text above. We're going to be talking more about ARIA label and ARIA labeled by later. This next example is using ARIA labeled by to add an additional accessible name to this link. And the last example here is using the label and input with for and ID. So for and ID are able to create programmatic associations between labels and inputs together to make sure that all interactive elements have an accessible name. We want to convey that ARIA can be really good, but it can also create a lot of problems. And when in doubt, no ARIA is often better than bad ARIA. When ARIA is used incorrectly, it creates a more inaccessible experience than an experience without ARIA in the first place.